Nu skal vi igen snakke innovation, og det bliver på engelsk. Peter Thirup Bæck er godt nok dansk, men han har boet og arbejdet så længe i London, så han foretrækker simpelthen at tage den her session på engelsk, og det har jeg sagt, det er sgu okay. Peter har i sit arbejde for tænketanken Nesta fulgt social innovation i Europa i 10 år eller sådan noget i den stil. Det var til. Og han ved om nogen, hvad der er værd at tage ved lære af, og hvad der absolut ikke er nogen grund til at gentage. Og på den baggrund så vil Peter tale om, hvordan vi alle sammen kan skabe mest mulig impact. Peter, scenen er din.
Jeg snakker fint dansk, men jeg må også indrømme, at jeg blev lidt miljøskadet. Jeg har arbejdet hele mit liv, efter jeg blev færdig med universitetet i London. Og når jeg kommer hjem og holder oplæg på dansk, så lyder jeg som en af de der rigtig, rigtig dårlige konsulenter, der bruger sådan engelske ord til at lyde smart hele tiden. Og for at undgå det, så skifter jeg til engelsk. I'm also doing it so that Christian can disagree with me as I go through my presentation. The other thing that's happened to me during my work is that I get so enthusiastic about everything that I speak incredibly fast. And the only method I found to fix it is that whenever it goes too fast, you don't understand what I'm saying because it's too fast or I mumble, just raise your hand, tell me, shut up, slow down, and I will. So please be honest with me. It's really important for me that you understand what I'm saying. So if it doesn't go through, we stop, I'll repeat. It's only because I care. So yeah, a bit about me. I thought what we would try and cover today would be these kind of 4 things. That's not me, that's the mic. Okay, I just want to say so.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm going to try and do 4 things today. 1, give you a quick introduction to who we are at Nesta. I know, Carsten, you said we were a think tank, but we are also a foundation with an endowment of around about £450 million, which, I don't know, depending on where the currencies are, is around about 4 billion Danish kroner, a bit more. And actually, then I want to start with answering one of the other questions that you raised for today, which is how do we have the most impact? And talk a bit about our work on collective intelligence, which, although there isn't all the evidence that I think you'd like to see in the method, I think is one of the methods that can really help us drive forward our impact in terms of solving big, complex, emerging social challenges. And then I want to end on jumping back and thinking about what I've observed in the UK for the last 10 years, in terms of impact measurement and how to help you avoid some of the pitfalls and mistakes that we've made. And I think some of the reasons why I'm here is that when I had one of my first conversations with you, I brought up that occasionally I go home to Denmark and I look at this fantastic country. I'm a patriot, I love the country, but I also sometimes get frustrated because in Denmark there is probably a better opportunity for social innovation and solving social challenges with civil society than most other places in the world. It's digitized, it's a lot of social capital, a strong kind of volunteering community, and everything's going right, but now and then you pick up on these trends from the UK or abroad, and you make these really silly, stupid mistakes that we've made. And I just wish you'd come and look what failed, drop it, and leapfrog ahead. And the best example of this is volunteering strategies. So you might remember David Cameron, big society. You know, he had this grand strategy around basically, in the beginning it was, if you just make the public sector smaller, and then we think about taking out maybe 1 or 2 public servants, and then we get 4 volunteers, sub them in, and the math works out. Cheaper and better. And of course, we realized in the UK after 4 years, lots of evaluation doesn't work because people don't want to volunteer just to do public service work. They volunteer because they care about things in their area. And lo and behold, then 3 years later, I see the Danish volunteering strategy. I apologize to anyone here. And we were saying the same thing. And I was like, no, this is not how we're supposed to do it. Learn from other people's failure, leapfrog ahead. So that's why I'm here. We made lots of mistakes in the UK. You can learn from it. I've been in the UK for 10 years. I'm originally from Frederikshavn up north, so if you can hear like a hint of a drawl in my kind of accent, that's where it's from. Quickly about Nesta. As I said, we are an innovation foundation. I read the interview with you, Christian. I guess if innovation is the plague, then maybe we're the virus. I don't hope it's that bad, but effectively we are set out to use our endowment to support and scale social innovations for the common good, and really try and say innovation not something that just happens in the private sector. I know that argument has been won for this audience, but there's lots of innovations that we can use for social purposes. Some are about taking the same methods, some are about developing bespoke and new methods and approaches for the social sector. We recently kind of jumped on to the mission-driven wagon, and we've kind of redesigned our organization to focus on these 3 big missions. A fairer start, which looks at supporting the under 5s with having the best possible start in life. That's a much bigger issue in the UK regarding inequality and access than it is in Denmark, but nonetheless relevant to you as well. A Healthy Life, looking mainly at obesity and healthy diets. And the biggest one of all, at least until yesterday, A Sustainable Future. Maybe peace should be the big one we all look at now. Within Nesta, we have these big missions, and then we have our own kind of what we call practice teams. There are teams that do different kinds of innovation methods, so the usual stuff, surf design, prototyping, behavioral science, data science, and I lead kind of perhaps the most kind of novel innovation method work is around collective intelligence. We call the Center for Collective Intelligence Design. We were set up around 4 years ago, and we spent the first 2-3 years looking at kind of how can we kind of understand how best to design to make the most of all of our collective knowledge. So for example, the knowledge in this room about how to scale in a kind of organized way to solve a common challenge. We have lots of good examples out there of kind of crowdsourcing citizen science that mobilizes people's knowledge, but they're all one-offs. And we wanted to understand what is it that kind of sits underneath these projects and how can we best design projects that kind of model and build on this. In the last 2 years, we then tried to kind of walk the talk a bit, and started doing projects ourselves, both with external partners and within our own missions. So, but I thought I'd start by kind of telling you what I think collective intelligence is. So it is the thing that is created when people work together, often with the help of technology, to mobilize a range of information, ideas, and insights to address a challenge. That's a very simple definition. Underneath that are multiple very long academic papers, but I'm not going to go into them today. I guess this is a very old idea, and it shouldn't be new to anyone. I guess what is new is our ability to do this in different ways, using technology, people, and data together to scale both of the kind of the number of people who can collaborate and the kind of depth and complexity of the stuff they can work together on. And I think Wikipedia, this is a well-worn example, but I think it always illustrates kind of the opportunity here, right? So when James Murray set out to kind of crowdsource the very first English dictionary, how many of you know this example? None of you, that's good. So in 1878, James Murray set out to kind of crowdsource the first English dictionary. And he got 474,000 written contributions from people all over the public. And they became the first dictionary in the UK. So it's a fantastic example of collective intelligence. It took him 70 years, right? 70 years to get all these written contributions in, write the dictionary, get it out there, crowdsourcing at its finest. Modern day Wikipedia, an edit every 1.2 seconds, 6 million new pages every month. And it kind of shows this kind of scale of kind of contribution, aggregation of knowledge that we can then share, and how that's really changed an old concept into something that we can do at a different scale now. I don't want to get into the hairy details of this, but I guess our work also looks at this kind of perhaps more complex challenge of how can we then move from just understanding how we mobilize our human collective intelligence to then understanding the relationship between that and artificial intelligence. The big problem here, anyone in here working on AI? Raise your hand now. We're going to fight, okay? Is that I guess most artificial intelligence, as we look at it now in society, is being designed to organize us, right? So AI tells us what to do. They create new hierarchy systems, and we follow them. And what we want to look at with our work is like, well, how can AI be used to mobilize us, connect us, and help us collaborate and solve problems together? And how could that perhaps be like a different approach to AI? One, by the way, would fit very well with the Danish model, and I wish there was more focus on that in Denmark rather than thinking about kind of copying a more kind of Silicon Valley-based approach to AI. I want to illustrate what that looks like in practice. I added this example this morning for 2 reasons. One, I realized the title of where we're meeting, but also because of current events. So We Taiwan is a fantastic example of kind of democratic innovation. So it is based in Taiwan, and it kind of grew out of the sunflower movement and the kind of the pressure towards kind of Taiwan moving more close towards China and an authoritarian state. And effectively, it tries to reinvent how we do policy. So in We Taiwan, citizens can work with experts in government on kind of crowdsourcing ideas for policy, and they've done quite simple everyday things like Uber regulation. So is that too fast? Is that you saying? No? Okay. Which I know has been a debate in Denmark. So in Taiwan, for example, people can work with experts in government and crowdsourcing ideas for how you want to regulate Uber, and then use a tool called Polis, which basically gets people to submit statements and arguments for which idea they like the most, and then machine learning aggregates all the statements that have the biggest consensus, and then that becomes the idea, that becomes government policy. They use that to create regulation on Uber, alcohol regulation, and other kind of policies in Taiwan. Another example is WeFarm. WeFarm has around about 100 million users in Kenya and Uganda, and is used by around about 40,000 people every day. It's based on this really simple idea that you have lots of farmers in sub-Saharan Africa who have deep knowledge about how to grow and farm. And when they have an issue, the best people to turn to are, of course, other farmers who experience issues like them. In a traditional setting, you might have a few people in your village or in your community you can ask. But here WeFarm has set up a service where you can text in your issue. That might be crop disease, weather forecast, what to plant when and with what kind of soil. And that goes out to the whole network of 1 million farmers. And machine learning pairs you and your question to the people in your network, distributed across Kenya and Uganda, who might have experienced similar issues, and they didn't text back within a minute or two. And that, again, is a beautiful example of using machine learning to aggregate knowledge of all these farmers, and also not being focused on technology that works for us, but that works for them. So using text-based services to connect people. And one of my recent favorite examples in COVID times is MetaSub. It uses this idea of citizen science, where people go out and do their own mini science experiments. In this case, volunteers go out on the metro and they take swaps of handrails and seats, and then they diagnose those swaps to understand if there's any new microbes, for example, COVID or COVID variants. Then all those swaps get analyzed and sent into a database where AI help aggregate all that data, and you create these kind of global patterns of like emerging patterns of antimicrobial resistance, new pathogens, which can then be used to model better responses faster to outbreaks or new viruses. And for me, it's a good example of like, I really wish we had this a couple of years ago, and we had a much better sense within society of how we can all kind of use our capacity to kind of generate new insight, new knowledge about a problem or potential future problem, and work together on addressing it. So that's the research we've done. We then try to understand what is it we can learn from organizations about how to do this well. We developed what we call the Collective Intelligence Design Playbook, which is basically another framework, another toolkit, the dreaded word that we spoke about earlier, which effectively talks about how you go through the almost traditional design journey of like understanding problems, designing solutions, making decisions, learning, evaluation, but using all these new tools for kind of working with big crowds and intelligence in the process. We then have tried to roll it out with a number of partners. Last year we finished a 2-year project with the United Nations Development Programme, testing it out with what they call their accelerator labs. So there are 13 labs across the world who work on kind of complex novel problems, and they try to use the playbook to develop different solutions to local problems. So in Ukraine, there's a big problem around open burning, for example. Open burning leads to air pollution, lots of local issues. And here they use similar tools like crowd mapping paired with satellite data to identify burning sites. And then based on that data, they then went into interviews with the people responsible for the burning to identify kind of the causes of the issues. There's another great example from Vietnam, where they worked with informal waste collectors and gave them mini sensors to create GPS tracking of their routes through cities to understand how do informal waste collectors work alongside formal waste collection, and how can you then start to integrate those two into a more kind of integrated informal and formal waste collection system. As 2 small examples. Just last week we finished this project working with one of our new teams at Nesta looking at healthy lives. I don't know the extent to which obesity within young children is a challenge in Denmark, but it's a massive and rapidly increasing problem in the UK. And of course, fast food advertising is one of the main issues that is driving the consumption of bad food. The problem is we don't know what fast food advertising young people are exposed to, because it's all driven by algorithms and set on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and so on. So in this case, we use what we call citizen social science. So we recruited 300 young people who basically took photos of their screen every time they saw an ad. And then they upload that ad onto our platform. And then we use something called crowd labeling and simple machine learning analysis to identify who were behind that ad, what product was on the ad, how many calories were in that ad, and also what was the demographic profile of the young people who were receiving those ads. Interestingly, the poorer you are, guess what? The more ads you get, and the worse the food is. And it's a really important piece of information for us, because in this case it helps us lobby and campaign against some of the big fast food companies to say, well, we do no wrong. So anyway, there's some examples around how I think you can have lots of impact using collective intelligence. I'm going to have a glass of water now. I had originally put down 6 random lessons, but it's actually down to 5, because the 6th one was a bit too there's lots of blogs and medias, and maybe this is the next evolution of Impact Insider, basically people who take the piss out of impact measurement. So like, my impact bigger than yours, beanbags and bullshit, because the industry has grown to such an extent that there are people who are so far removed from the reality of doing good, that they're so caught up in the language about impact measurement that they don't, it's just words, there's no doing. But I thought it was a bit too contrarian, so I kind of jumped off that. But I do want to say that I am going to try and be a bit contrarian in these 5 points. But I do fundamentally, of course, believe in the value of impact measurement and having strong evidence of impact as a route to scale. I've done it in the past. All my work for the first 5 years in the UK was focused on co-production in healthcare, to your question from earlier, and then building the business case around peer support in mental health, for example, peer support for people who have long-term health conditions, and what is the value of those things, and once we understand the real value of them, how can we make the public sector pay for those things alongside paying for drugs, hardware, and specialists, and how do you change the whole commissioning, paying system, referral system. So I do believe in it, but I also feel like sometimes the focus on the business case, the scalability, complying with the framework, takes focus away from the people who just want to do really good things and have a passion. That's back to my question to you earlier. Last night I went for dinner with a friend of mine, and I can't say what her NGO is or who the funder is, because then that wouldn't be good for anyone. But we were talking about some of my critique, and they run a fantastic NGO, and she's just been given a 2 million grant from a really big Danish foundation, and she was saying, I recognize this pattern, Peter. In the application we have to talk about our impact, our reach, our scalability model. I just want to work with some minority groups we know works. I have proof, but I don't have time for this. Also, like, what is scalability? I live on Vesterbro, and I think there is something in there around, like, who do you want to help and how do you best help them, rather than how do you kind of cram the people you want to help into a framework that helps you kind of talk about scalability, innovation, or whatever language that you've developed in your strategy. And I am a sinner, and I've done this in many calls and funding arrangements I've set up, but I think it's really, really important. And I think it's also really important to remember that not everybody wants to scale. There are lots of great innovations out there that offer very local solutions, and that's fine. We shouldn't always assume. We might disagree, Christian, but I do think that there is this kind of thing that sometimes we put too much emphasis on scalability early on, and also maybe sometimes the risk here is also that creates too narrow a frame, and the stuff that is scalable has nothing to do with the frameworks we apply to understanding what is scalable in the future. I use Greta Thunberg as an example. Like, no one would have gone in front of where she was sitting in Sweden and understood what is the scalability of this movement and what is the opportunity of that to have impact. And I think it's just sometimes having that in our mind and our frame. And I think the second thing is, when we think about scalability, at least in the UK, often it's about like scaling the business or replicating the product. And I guess for me it's also really important to say, I guess there are other routes to impact than that. Changing norms, building social movements, being an amazing campaigner. And again, we shouldn't dismiss them as we look at, like, how can we back people, support them, fund them to have the most impact possible. This is a framework developed by our friends in States of Change, whose CEO is now based here in Copenhagen. So I'm now going to go into my five points, and then we can have some questions, and Chris and I can disagree a bit. The first point is, what is impact? I still think this is the biggest issue out there. This is one analysis of, like, different ways in which investors and impact investment talk about their impact investment strategy. And on this side over here, you basically have, like, just don't do evil. And then on the other side, you have, like, really close to philanthropic capital, giving out grants, maybe a convertible grant that might become a loan if you might become popular in the future. And on one side, you have a strong focus on social impact. Another one, you want to make money, but you also just want to maybe to say that you didn't kill people in the process. And I guess it's, when you see BlackRock saying, we are now a social investor because we don't do drugs and pharma, I'm like, you're not, right? And I think there's this big risk of, like, impact and impact measurement and social impact becomes such a big sector that's so diverse that it doesn't really mean anything to anyone anymore. So when you as a funder think about this, like, what is the impact we're seeking? And also, how do we think about do you want to go back to that slide? Okay, fair enough. And the second point is perhaps a bit more complex one, but I think the biggest issue, which is, the more we focus about impact measurement, we are focusing about what is realistic and achievable in the here and now. And we focus in this, what I call the first horizon. We live in a world of kind of lots of assumptions and paradigms, and we fund solutions that work within them: homelessness, obesity, healthcare, climate change. And that's good, but it means that we never really move beyond thinking about the third horizon, the second horizon. The second horizon being kind of big changes we can have to the current system, but not radically changing kind of how the whole system operates, how everything fits together. And then kind of funding the third horizon, which is completely different systems, way of organizing society, ways of doing things. As a problem, the people who get to do this work, they're typically people who look like me, who are very rich, who just done some sort of exit in Silicon Valley, and then they get speculative about the future and percentages of grand ideas at kind of conferences and develop big companies that kind of tell us what the future is going to be. But the people who are kind of grounded in civil society, organizations like the one that you want to support, they sit over here. It can only get the funding to kind of do the everyday work without kind of radically rethinking models for the future. I think there's a kind of some kind of illustration in what's his name, Jarkonovsky? I forgot his name. The founder of GiveWell. So do you know these two examples? So GiveWell was set up this principle that you want to understand how can you have the most impact with every dollar you give. What is the intervention that has the most proof behind it? And you know, the editors always say, if you want to have the most impact per dollar on human lives, malaria nets, clean water, right? The evidence is there. So if you want to focus, regardless, saving lives, GiveWell will tell you that's where you put your money. And they have a massive database where they capture all the evidence on all the interventions, and they'll help donors, both individual givers and big foundations, to target their giving to be the most effective possible, which is great. But as he reveals in this podcast, which I really recommend you listen to with Vanessa Klein, that also kind of puts a very narrow, kind of short-term kind of perspective on the world, because you keep focusing on interventions in the here and now. So they set up open philanthropy, as he says, to almost focus about what would the world look like in a million years. It's a bit extreme, but like, how can we fund the long-term ideas? What will work in the future? It's the same founder, but thinking about two very different foundations, two organizations thinking about evidence and impact. One in the short term, one in the very long term. And I really believe in this. And I think, so at Nesta, we do a lot of work on this as well. We call it participatory futures, but like how can we kind of involve the public more in kind of speculating about what could different futures look like and how can we invest in it. And in another world, I would invite you all to play our game with us, which is about how we can envisage different versions of the future. The third point, and I kind of covered this already, but like find the right framework for the cause. Many years ago, back in 2012, we developed these things called standards of evidence, which effectively takes you from, in level 1, you can have like a simple fear of change. Level 2, you can do some A/B testing, right through to having an RCT and the full kind of package of evidence. And then we thought we'd use this with all our grantees. Whenever we give money out in Nesta, we could say, at least you do level 1, and you can maybe do level 2 and onwards. Lots of grantees couldn't even get to level 1, so we couldn't fund anyone. And I think there's this kind of understanding of like, when you want to fund people, like if you want to use these frameworks, at least make sure they understand what you're talking about and they can comply. Because obviously you exclude so many organizations and people who do really good work. And also I think sometimes there's a focus on maybe on evidence for the sake of it, because people like me or others said, well, you have to have an RCT because that is the gold standard. But like if you're a small community-based organizations with 10,000 volunteers or 10,000 users and maybe a couple of volunteers, like maybe you can't do it. You know, an RCT is pretty far off from you, right? So kind of really think about kind of what is the right impact measurement framework for the right cause, and also think about like what do other organizations like you use. Also because I think consultants, coming back to the point I didn't include, who do impact measurement, will always want to sell you the most complex framework that they can spend the most time kind of implementing for you. Apologies to the consultants in the room, but you know, I think there is a real risk of this. And then there's this kind of more fundamental questions about whose impact are you achieving. I'm doing some work at the moment with a very, very, very big development bank, looking at what we call the digital commons or open digital infrastructure. And how many of you are familiar with OpenStreetMap? Show of hands. Yeah. So OpenStreetMap, you know, fantastic example. Alternative to Google Maps, everyone can create a map of everything really, and it's now the world's largest kind of open source map of the world, but also of like lots of specific local issues. If you want to download it, I think one file of OpenStreetMap is now 1.4 something terabyte. It's massive. On OpenStreetMap, you've built some of these amazing projects, Ushahidi, of course, being the most kind of famous one, that's been used to track everything from election violence to kind of transparency of aid delivery to harassment and others. And funders always want to back the projects themselves that's built on the open source software, on the open infrastructure. They never want to back the kind of foundations themselves because that doesn't comply. There's not a project there, there's just foundations. And in a world that's increasingly kind of driven by digital innovation, if you don't have good quality open source software, open source hardware, open data, access to it, then we can't do any of the other things. But funders can't get into the mindset about funding infrastructure. Isn't that what we do? We fund projects and activities. And also, if I fund OpenStreetMap, but someone else has impact doing a project of it, can I claim that impact? Who does it? I think that is a big fundamental problem. This is linked to that, which is perhaps more around, I think we discussed this at our table earlier, but I think you do run a kind of clean tech startup. But I think, I spent 4 years working for the European Commission on mapping kind of the space of organizations in Europe who work on kind of tech for good, or what we call digital social innovation. And here, there is this kind of misconception that as soon as someone falls into the trap of doing stuff that's digital, funders naturally assume that they are a tech startup. You know, if you do stuff offline with people, you can be a civil society organizations that get grants and do stuff. But if you do technology, it is technology for startups. And there is like a route to scale and a path to investment that is always private capital. And that route, and it doesn't work. Like, why shouldn't civil society organizations do volunteering and other things also be able to get grant funding and other kind of means of finance? So anyway, I'm looking at the clock. I've spoken for more than 25 minutes, and that was not the intention. But I think there are kind of my 5 kind of main lessons from the work to be done on like stuff not to do, or at least stuff to do like slightly better than what we've done in the past. I hope that makes sense, and also that I didn't speak too fast. Anyway, thank you very much.
And now it's time for questions. Anybody here would like to ask Peter something?
If there are no questions, it means I spoke too fast and it didn't make sense. So.
Or of course that everybody understood everything.
That's never happened to me, and this would be a really unique example. I guess my other question is, does this happen in Denmark? Yeah, there's a question down here. We can do questions in Danish, by the way, if you want to.
Yeah, okay. I'll try in English, that's okay. And I didn't think this through, so this is just a trick of my mind then. But sort of hearing your the innovations that you've showed us here today, and many of them being very has a technological basis, right? I'm sort of thinking, if I work within the social sector, and I believe some of them are like new ways of working within the social sector, and I'm sort of just having this question in my mind, seeing all your examples, whether we sometimes miss out on innovations that are not technological. I think you touched upon it when you said peer support, something like that. I just feel like sometimes I've also been in the public sector, and sometimes when we talked about innovation, we were sort of automatically thinking about technology, IT systems, stuff like that. And I just feel a little bit like that today. Maybe some of the greatest social innovations that could be out there would be like looking at basically something like the medical model, or all those kinds of sort of basic structures that our health system is built upon. So do you see it the same way?
I completely agree with you. Sorry, that I think there are lots of fantastic innovations, and there was lots of opportunity for innovation that's got nothing to do with what I just showed you. That is completely offline, and that's a great thing. The example I was talking about, my friend yesterday that I can't name, is an entirely offline, community-based. I guess what I'm talking about here was just to give you a hint of like, a lot of my work is about like the kind of future methods at the kind of edge of like what we should do next. But I also think there's a very long tail and lots of things that we can do well just with doing kind of more traditional approaches to innovation. I should also say, I guess the work of Nesta on innovation methods have focused a lot around kind of trying to help the sector develop new approaches to doing innovation, which means that something like if you take service design, prototyping, kind of more quite standard approach from the private sector, which when I moved to London, I was part of one of the first sort of enterprises who took that approach and applied it within the social sector, and just said like, how you do like service design and prototyping within first education and then children's social services. Now there is like a thriving market for that, at least in the UK. There are agencies to do it, they provide support to charities, the public sector, and we've kind of moved on at Nesta from talking about it because the sector has the market has sorted itself out. So, and they do a lot of the work that you would talk about there. And I guess our job is to say like, so what's next? And they're just 2 big challenges, one around scale, and then that's one about digital, and ensuring that when we think about digital, it's also digital for the purpose of solving social challenges rather than helping you buy more stuff, which is kind of how it's often being developed. So I completely agree with you.
to my question because I think there's a lot of discussion about big tech and the use of our data and everything that will give away the example you had with the food, the fast food. Believing in collective intelligence, I mean, how do we balance this? Do you see a threat from this discussion about abuse and misuse of our data when we want to use collective intelligence for good?
Yeah, I guess the point is that in any context where you use data, there will be misuse and abuse, and I think that's all about kind of governance, standards, rights. I guess what we did here with our example of the citizen science experiment, first it's important to say that we recruit volunteers who do the research themselves, so that and they also become empowered. So the interesting thing in the citizen science experiment was that the young people who took part after that has said, and this is not an RCT, but they have said in a survey, I'm now making different choices about my food because I took part in documenting it. So I think there is a threat. I don't think it's a novel or complex threat if you can deal with just rights, GDPR, governance. But I think there's a more fundamental question which is around, I'm going to answer a question you didn't ask me, but I think that's interesting. But I think more broadly around how we think, what is the role of civil society and in kind of governing and challenging the data we do collect and how data has been collected and what data has been collected about us does to us. So one example I didn't use today, but that I often talk about is a project called Common Voice, developed by Mozilla Foundation. And it basically, in all your phones, you'll have an artificial agent that basically listens to you and helps you order food, put on Alexa, whatever. That data is trained on some data sets. Most of those data sets are by people who look like me or look like you, like white people, somewhere between 30 and 50, out of America. And it turns out that those agents, when you have a particular accent, you come from a particular kind of culture, they don't understand you, which means that a lot of people are kind of excluded from having artificial agents in their phones. And Open Voice is basically about creating the world's largest data set, trained by volunteers. So you can go in on the website, you're asked to kind of read out a couple of sentences, say who you are, say what your language is, and what cultural background you have, male, woman, how old, and then that becomes part of data, so anyone can train an artificial agent for your phone or for any other device that can serve you, and therefore create, I guess, a more fair product that works for everybody. And that's one example, I guess, more like flipping that data question into a positive.
Vi har tid til 2 spørgsmål mere, hvis der er 2 spørgsmål mere. Der var i hvert fald lidt dernede. Hold ud. Så meget som man kan.
I just need how to word it. Maybe coming in from left, but how do you view what's happening in crypto right now and when we're talking about technology and how it will affect the space you're working in?
It's a massive Ponzi scheme. I think I think there might be some value to kind of blockchain and digital ledger technology, but I find it, to your point earlier around technology, like blockchain is kind of a sector that sits on the kind of the periphery of a lot of my research, but you're still looking for like what's the value here? Why are we spending billions, or not billions, maybe hundreds of millions on technology that's proving very little value to people and spending that money maybe on homelessness, for example, instead. And I think in crypto, again, is that kind of fascination with like an alternative product to what we have, but there's no real value in, and all you get is speculation. And effectively, if you speak to the idealists, in the sector, and you think about Bitcoin, it's about kind of digitalization and community ownership and getting rid of the central banks. But the reality is, 10% of investors own 90% of assets, and they can massively kind of, manipulate prices in the market, and you have the whales and so on. So it's just taken the old system and made it worse, right? So I don't really have, anyway, but that, maybe I'm being a bit contrarian here, but I don't have many hopes for crypto as it currently set up, because it doesn't live up to any of the like fundamental kind of principle that's set out around decentralization. Sorry.
One final question.
I would really disagree, but you see projects like Bitcoin, how they funded new projects and fundraising mechanisms and what's happening within financing right now is super interesting because you have this ability to do system design, and a lot of things is crypto, but I think also tokenization, what we're seeing in emerging markets is super interesting. And it is in fact, I would say, a way to get out of the old system and into new ways of doing system design around communities and questions.
Yeah, so I spent about 4 years working on fintech and crowdfunding in the UK. I've done lots of work with the government on this, and I guess just some of the trends and some of the attributes people kind of give towards crypto, I just don't see the big difference between that and kind of more kind of simple principle of kind of crowd finance, beyond some of the kind of, then traceability and transparency, but then also think about like, what can be done in a spreadsheet, and also how much computing power do you want to burn on some of these ledgers versus, the benefit of them. I think you and I need to have a beer and a long discussion about this. So, yeah.
Preston, I think you have a question.
It's going to be a complicated one. Long.
Just quickly, perhaps less of a question, but already showcasing how we can agree and disagree at the same time about the important issue of scaling. I think this is so important that I just want to put it into context, because you will have to make decisions to what extent are you going to scale your organization's business models. I agree with you that we cannot tell founders of organizations what their level of ambitions or scaling should be. That's a normative issue. Founders need to decide themselves. Just be aware of the consequences. If you decide to stay small and local and not scale, that's okay, but be aware of the consequences of that decision. Your performance will go down over time, because if you continue to do the same thing, you will get lazy and your performance will definitely decline. We see this again and again and again in these types of organizations. You need an element of scaling just to stay at the same place in your organization. Other consequences of the decision not to scale is you're depriving your staff of opportunities for personal growth and development, because you keep doing the same thing in small local projects. And you are not creating career channels that allow your staff to move into senior management positions one day, which means you're losing people. Just be aware of the consequences of not scaling. You're creating a pathological organization if you do that, and your performance will decline. There's no way out.
Yeah, but I think it's really important to say I agree with all of that. I was trying to present the contrarian view, and I think there's somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
Okay, great. That was the final question for Peter. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
Og nu skal I igen til at arbejde lidt selv. I skal gribe jeres skrive.